The auction yard sat under a pale morning sky, the kind of sky that looked too quiet for the noise that usually filled that place. Wagons creaked, boots scuffed the dusty ground, and traders talked in low voices as if making deals carried its own kind of secrecy. The smell of hay and sweat hung in the air. Horses shifted restlessly behind wooden rails, some tossing their heads, others standing still with heavy, tired eyes. Everyone had come to find something worth taking home, something strong enough or skilled enough to justify the price they paid. But not every animal earned a second glance. Some were ignored before they even stepped into the ring. Near the far end of the yard stood a tiny horse that barely reached the chest of the larger animals around him. His coat was clean but dull, and his mane hung unevenly, showing signs of rough handling. Many had already passed him by without stopping. A few men laughed softly when they noticed him, calling him too small to be useful. Others shook their heads and moved on quickly, focusing on the horses that promised real value. The little one stood there quietly, his ears twitching now and then, as if he was trying to understand why every person who walked past refused to meet his eyes. A young man stood by the fence not too far from him. He kept his hands tucked in his pockets as he watched the crowd. His clothes were simple, worn from long days of hard work, and his boots carried the kind of dust that never fully came off. His family did not have much, but he carried himself with a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from years of learning to work with whatever life gave him. He had come to the auction hoping to find a strong horse that could help him around the small patch of land he tended. He knew he could not afford much, but he hoped luck might be on his side for once. He scanned the animals carefully. Some looked impressive, muscles firm and coats glossy. Others were clearly tired from long travel, but still held their heads high. But his attention kept drifting back to the tiny horse standing alone. The more he looked at him, the more he felt something tug gently inside him. He could not explain why. It was strange to feel drawn to an animal that most people dismissed without a second thought. Yet he could not shake the sense that there was something different about that little horse, something deeper than what the eye could see at first glance. The auctioneer raised his voice, announcing the next round of bidding. The crowd tightened around the ring. Horses were led forward one by one, their hooves clacking against the wooden boards. Prices rose and fell. Some buyers cheered quietly when they won, while others muttered under their breath when they were outbid. The young man listened closely, calculating what he could afford. Every time the price went higher than he expected, he felt his hopes slip further away, but he stayed near the rail, refusing to leave just yet. Eventually the handler pulled the tiny horse into the ring. The animal stumbled slightly as he entered, his steps careful, as if he did not trust the ground beneath him. A few people near the front snickered. One man called out something about wasting time. The auctioneer did his best to sound hopeful, but even his voice carried the strain of knowing how this would go. He started the bidding low, no hands went up. He lowered the price again, still no one moved. The tiny horse stood there, blinking slowly, unsure of why attention felt heavier than before. The handler tugged at the rope around his neck, but the horse did not resist. He simply stood and waited. The auctioneer tried one last time to encourage the crowd. He mentioned the horse might be trainable with patience. He mentioned that smaller animals sometimes surprised people with their strength, but no one cared enough to take a risk. The silence grew longer, the handlers exchanged awkward looks. It became clear to everyone that the tiny horse was unwanted. The young man felt a tightening in his chest as he watched the scene. He could not ignore the sinking feeling that came every time someone laughed at the little horse or turned away without a shred of kindness. Something about that rejection felt wrong. He kept watching the horse's eyes. They held no anger or fear, only a quiet, tired acceptance, as if he had grown used to being overlooked. Before he realized what he was doing, the young man raised his hand. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then pointed toward him with quick relief. He called the final price, hardly believing anyone had stepped forward. No one else challenged the bid. The hammer fell. The tiny horse had a buyer. Whispers spread around the ring. Some shrugged. Some laughed. A few shook their heads, certain the young man had wasted the little money he had. They were sure he would regret the decision before the week was over. But the young man ignored the noise. He left the crowd and walked toward the gate where the horse was being led. His steps were steady, and for the first time that morning, he felt like he had made a choice that mattered more than he could explain. The handler handed him the rope, with a half-hearted warning that the little horse might be more trouble than he looked. The young man nodded politely and took the rope in his hand. The tiny horse lifted his head slightly, studying the boy with a slow, thoughtful gaze. The young man knelt beside him and touched his neck gently. The horse flinched at first, then relaxed as if realizing the touch carried no harshness. For a brief moment, the young man felt a spark of something unexpected, something warm and promising. He led the horse out of the yard, away from the staring eyes and whispered judgments. As they reached the open path beyond the gates, a light breeze brushed over them, carrying the smell of fresh grass and open fields. The tiny horse walked beside him quietly, not dragging his feet or pulling away. It felt almost as if he understood he was finally going somewhere he belonged. But even as the young man felt hopeful, a strange feeling tugged at him. He could not explain it. It was not fear, but more like a sense that this small horse carried a story he did not yet know. A story that might change more than his daily work or the burden on his shoulders. There was a depth in the horse's eyes that hinted at something hidden, something waiting. As they moved farther from the auction yard, the tiny horse paused suddenly. His ears pricked forward, his body stiffening as he stared toward a distant ridge. The young man followed his gaze, trying to see what had caught his attention. There was nothing visible, nothing moving, yet the horse remained locked in place. His breathing changed slightly, and a quiet tension moved through him. The young man laid a hand on his back, wondering if the horse sensed danger or simply remembered something from his past. The horse did not move. He only stared, as if he expected something to appear on the ridge at any moment. The path ahead stretched long and uncertain. The boy tightened his grip on the rope, his heart beating harder than before. He had bought the tiny horse because no one else wanted him. But now, standing beside him on that quiet road, he began to realize he may have stepped into something far larger than a simple auction decision. Something about this horse was different, and whatever waited ahead, it was already beginning to stir. The morning light was soft and weak, barely pushing through the thin layer of fog that had gathered overnight. It made the landscape look muted, as if everything had been washed with a pale brush. As I walked farther down the worn path, the stillness pressed against me in a way that felt almost intentional. I kept thinking back to the strange details mentioned earlier and how they kept looping, in my mind like they were trying to fit together into a pattern I had not yet understood. Every small sound felt sharper than usual, every breath seemed louder. It felt like the world was slowing down, asking me to pay attention. I knew that if I wanted answers, I had to understand the people connected to this place. No mystery existed without human hearts tied into it, and this one was no different. The neighbors I had briefly met earlier gave half smiles and shy greetings, but their eyes carried weight. It was the kind of weight people get when they know more than they say. When I reached the small wooden gate at the end of the lane, I paused for a moment. The air changed there. It carried a faint scent of hay mixed with something older, something forgotten. The gate was slightly crooked, its hinges barely holding on. Someone had opened and closed it many times, but never with care. It swung with the tiredness of a memory. Beyond it was a field that had once looked lively, filled with the noise of horses and the steady rhythm of routine work. Now it stretched out silent and empty, the ground uneven as if it had been stepped on too many times and then abandoned. The old barn stood at the far end, a long shadow lying across its faded walls. The roof sagged on one side and the door hung open in a way that suggested it had not been shut properly in years. There was no wind, yet something inside shifted with a soft thump that made my skin prickle. It was most likely a loose plank, but the timing felt too perfect, too eerie. My footsteps felt too loud as I crossed the field. I noticed old hoof marks near the edges of the pasture. Some were deep and fresh enough that they could not have been from long ago. That small detail tugged at my curiosity even harder. Someone had been here recently? Someone who cared enough to bring a horse back onto this land, or maybe someone who had no choice but to use it. I knelt down to get a closer look. The edges of the prints were sharp, not yet softened by wind or time. The thought made my mind spin with new questions. If the place was so abandoned, who had been here, and why? As I stood up, I noticed a figure watching from the far fence line. At first I thought it was only a shadow caught by the morning haze, but the shape was too solid. A person stood there, still as a post, arms resting on the top rail. I could not make out their face from where I was, but the stance seemed familiar in a distant way, like someone I had seen before but never spoken to. When I took a small step forward, the figure did not move, but I felt something in the air shift between us. Not threatening, but cautious, curious. I lifted my hand in a small greeting, but before I could call out, the figure turned away and walked along the fence line until they disappeared behind a cluster of old trees. They did not run, yet their steps held urgency, almost like they did not want to be seen. I headed toward the barn, still thinking about the stranger and what connection they might have to this place. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Dust floated in thin lines where the light slipped through cracks. The boards creaked under my weight. The smell of old feed and dried wood mixed with something else, something faint but unmistakable. It was the smell of a horse, a real, living horse. My heart beat faster. I followed the scent until I found one stall that looked different from the rest. While the others were covered in dust and cobwebs, this one had clean marks along the wooden sides. Someone had wiped them down recently. Straw inside had been moved around. A small bucket sat in the corner with water still inside it. Not old water, not stagnant, fresh. The sight made the mystery stretch wider, but it also made something in me soften. That meant there was life here. That meant someone had not given up on this place, even if everyone else had. As I leaned closer, I noticed a faint scratch on the stall door, like a horse had dragged its hoof across it. It formed a rough diagonal line. Not enough to mean anything, but enough to show activity. Enough to show presence. I listened for any sign of movement, holding my breath without meaning to. The barn stayed quiet except for an occasional creak. Still, the sense that someone or something had been there only moments ago refused to fade. I stepped back outside to clear my head. The fog had thinned by then, revealing more of the surrounding land. Fields stretched into rolling hills, and beyond them the first line of the forest stood tall and silent. The forest looked beautiful from a distance, but its depth carried a quiet warning. People often disappeared into it, not physically but emotionally, letting the thick trees swallow their secrets. The locals spoke about it with care, never too casually. I glanced toward its edge and noticed how the ground looked slightly disturbed, like footsteps had been there recently. The pattern was uneven, almost like someone had walked back and forth several times, as though unsure whether to enter the trees or stay in the open field. While I was trying to piece these things together, an older man approached from the direction of the lane. He walked slowly, but his eyes were sharp. His clothing was worn but tidy, and he carried a sense of quiet authority. When he reached me, he stopped a few feet away, studying my face with a mixture of caution and recognition. He introduced himself with a kind voice, but there was a heaviness behind it. I explained why I was there, and he nodded with a thoughtful look, as if he had been expecting the question but not the timing. He glanced toward the barn, then toward the forest, and finally back at me. He did not give direct answers, and that only added to the tension already building inside the story. He spoke in hints and pieces. He mentioned the land had a history that people preferred not to talk about. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was painful. He said the old barn still held memories of better days, days filled with laughter, training sessions, and proud horse owners. But something changed years ago. Something he refused to name directly. His eyes darkened for a moment when he talked about it, not with anger, but with sorrow. He paused often, choosing his words with care. He kept saying that some things were lost, but not gone. Hidden, but not forgotten. I wanted to ask him who the figure at the fence line was, but before I could, he gently redirected the conversation, almost as if he knew what I was going to ask and wanted to avoid it. He did say something that caught my attention, though. He said not everyone who visited the property came with the same intention. Some came to remember, some came to hide. Some came to find answers for themselves. His gaze grew distant at that moment, as if he was thinking of someone specific. It made me wonder if the person I saw earlier was connected to him, or to whatever history he struggled to mention. Before leaving, he placed a hand on the gate and looked at the land with a quiet longing. He said that mysteries often grow where silence settles for too long, and this place had been silent for years. He warned me that once I start digging into the truth, I might uncover things that could change my view of the people around me. His words stayed with me long after he walked away down the lane, disappearing as slowly and quietly as he had arrived. I took another slow look at the barn, the fields, and the distant forest. Everything felt connected in ways I could not yet see. Something had happened here, something unfinished, something waiting. The past lingered like a shadow beside me, patient and heavy. And as much as part of me wanted to step away, another part felt drawn deeper into the mystery. I knew this was only the beginning. The clues were scattered everywhere around me, woven into the land, the old structures, and the guarded expressions of the people who knew far more than they admitted. Whatever secret had been buried here was not meant to stay hidden forever. I felt the quiet pull of it, urging me forward, asking me to uncover what had been lost. The story was spreading out in front of me, waiting for its truth to surface, and I knew I was already in too deep to turn back now. The quiet settled again after the old man left, but it settled in the wrong way. Not peaceful, not comforting. It felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the barn door that still hung slightly open. The memory of the fresh water bucket and the clean marks inside the stall played over and over in my mind. If someone had cared enough to keep a horse there recently, why had they gone through so much effort to hide it? And why leave so suddenly? The questions pushed at me like steady pressure against my chest. I decided to circle the barn from the outside before going back in. Maybe I had missed something earlier. The ground on the left side was packed with old tracks, but mixed within them were a few newer ones. Not hoofprints this time. Footprints. They were light, careful, almost like the person tried not to disturb the dirt too much. They led from the barn toward the fence line and then curved sharply as if whoever made them had turned back at the last second. It was strange, the kind of strange that felt purposeful. Like the person kept changing their mind, unsure where to go or what to do. The tension in the air grew heavier. The wind finally picked up slightly, sweeping across the dry grass and carrying a faint sound from the forest. A soft, rustling, steady, deliberate. I tried to focus on the direction it came from, but the forest edge stood still again. Nothing moved. Still, I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching from somewhere hidden. The land had too many corners where eyes could hide. Shadows under leaning branches, gaps between fence posts, the dark slits of broken boards on the barn. It was easy for someone to stay unseen if they wanted to. I walked back inside the barn, letting my fingers trail lightly along the wooden wall. The rough texture felt grounding. It reminded me that this place had once been full of life. Even the old beams overhead carried marks from ropes that had been tied there long ago. A reminder of training sessions, restless horses, and long days of work. But those memories felt far away, overshadowed by the strange present. Something caught my eye on the ground near the stall with the fresh signs. A faint scrap of fabric, pale blue, wedged between two boards. I crouched and gently pulled it free. It was small, torn at the edges, as if caught during a rushed movement. The material was soft, something people usually wore for comfort, not work. I folded it and slipped it into my pocket, unsure if it meant anything yet. It felt important to keep it. Outside, the sky was shifting into a brighter shade as the sun struggled to break through the leftover morning haze. I walked toward the fence line where I had seen the figure earlier. The wood was rough and weathered, worn by years of sun and rain. But on the top rail, right where the person had rested their arms, the surface looked cleaner. A faint trace of pressure still marked the dust. The person had not been standing there long ago. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. The thought sent a slow chill through me. As I stood there, I heard footsteps behind me. Light ones, quick. I turned just in time to see a young woman walking toward me with a cautious expression. She was in her early 20s, dressed plainly, hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her steps slowed when she saw that I noticed her. She hesitated, then forced a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Mara, saying she lived nearby and came through the area often. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, as if she were trying to stay calm, but could not mask the nerves settling under her skin. I asked if she knew anything about the property. She nodded slowly, her gaze shifting toward the barn. Something soft in her expression, mixed with fear and something that looked almost like guilt. She said she used to come here as a child, that her family had known the previous owners well. But when I asked what happened to them, she tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. She said the past was complicated, that some people carried regrets too heavy to speak out loud. She did not go into detail, but her tone hinted that she knew far more than she allowed herself to say. When I mentioned the figure at the fence line earlier, her eyes widened. She asked what the person looked like, but when I described the silhouette, her shoulders dropped with a strange mix of relief and worry. She said there were always people who wandered near the property, drawn by memories or something else they could not let go. But she warned me not to approach the forest alone. Her voice turned firm at that point, as if she had seen something there once and never forgot it. Before I could ask anything else, she said she needed to be somewhere and hurried away. She kept looking over her shoulder until she was far down the lane. Her sudden arrival and quick departure left a fresh layer of questions behind, and the tension in the air grew tighter. I walked along the fence toward the forest edge again, this time studying the pattern of disturbed soil more closely. Some of the footprints were small, lighter than the ones near the barn, possibly a child or someone with a light step. Others were deeper, spaced farther apart, belonging to someone taller with a stronger stride. The mix of footprints looked chaotic, like different people had come here at different times for different reasons, but one set caught my attention more than the rest. It led straight into the first line of trees, then disappeared into the shadowed area beyond. I hesitated, remembering Mara's warning, but curiosity pulled stronger. I stepped closer to the trees and felt the temperature drop slightly. The branches formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting uneven shadows across the ground. I could hear birds somewhere deeper inside, but the sound was muted. The forest felt alive, but not in a welcoming way, more like it was aware of anyone who stepped near it. I followed the footprints only a short distance before deciding it was better not to go further alone. Something about the silence felt unnatural, almost expectant. I turned back toward the field, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me. The barn stood quiet again, but I could not unsee the fresh marks inside or the fabric scraps still in my pocket. Before leaving the property for the day, I decided to visit the small house near the lane. It looked empty from the outside, but I had noticed smoke earlier drifting from the chimney. When I knocked on the door, an older woman opened it. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, measuring my intentions. She introduced herself politely, but there was a guarded tone behind her words. Like Mara and the old man, she seemed to know more than she wanted to share. When I asked about the land, she sighed, leaning against the doorframe. She said that everyone around here had grown used to living with things they did not fully understand, that sometimes the truth carried more pain than silence. She mentioned that the property had changed hands several times after the incident years ago. The way she said incident made the hair on my arms rise. She would not explain further. Instead, she said some people tried to fix what happened, while others tried to erase it. Neither group succeeded. The land kept the memories alive whether people liked it or not. She asked if I had gone inside the barn. I nodded. Her expression tightened. She warned me that places with unfinished stories had a way of pulling people deeper without them realizing it, that even simple clues could open doors better left closed. But she also said something that felt important. She said the truth was always tied to the people who stayed silent the longest, and that sooner or later silence breaks. When I asked her if she knew who had been on the property recently, she looked down at her hands. She said she had heard footsteps at night, soft ones like someone pacing back and forth. She thought it might be the same person who had brought a horse there again. When I asked who that person might be, she paused too long. Her silence said enough. She knew. She just would not say. I thanked her and stepped away from the house. My mind was crowded with questions, each one pulling at the edges of the mystery. The fresh signs in the barn, the figure at the fence line, Mara's warnings, the old man's sorrow, the woman's caution. They all pointed in different directions, yet felt connected. As I headed back toward the property's entrance, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of something metallic clinking near the barn. I looked back and saw the stall door shift slightly, even though no one was near it. The movement was too controlled to be from the wind alone. Someone had been inside recently. Maybe still was. The tension grew deeper and more layered, weaving through every part of the land. I walked away slowly, knowing I was nowhere close to the answers. The conflict was only beginning to reveal its edges, and every new detail only pulled me further into the tangled story that was waiting to unfold. For the next few days, the property lingered in my mind like a quiet weight I could not shake off. Every small detail replayed itself again and again: the fresh marks in the stall, the faint footprints near the forest, Mara's uneasy warning, the older woman's fear, and that odd shift of the stall door when no one was near it. Everything seemed to point toward a truth buried deeper than anyone wanted to admit. But the one thought that clung to me the most was the idea that someone had been caring for a horse in secret. A tiny horse that everyone once rejected, hidden away for reasons I could not understand yet. Each morning I found myself drawn back to the property without even planning it. Something about the land seemed to call me, like the story there was reaching out and tightening around me piece by piece. The air always felt heavier the moment I stepped through the gate, as if the ground remembered who had walked there last. Some places hold on to footsteps long after the person has gone, and this land felt like one of those. On the third day, I arrived just after sunrise. The sky carried a thin line of pale yellow across the horizon, and the early light settled on the barn with a soft glow that made the wood look more worn than ever. I walked quietly, listening for anything unusual. The wind brushed through the grass, and the birds sang a little higher up in the trees. Yet underneath those sounds was something else. A faint rhythm, almost like breathing, steady but distant. I moved closer to the barn. The door was slightly open, the same way I had left it last time. Except now the crack was wider, as if someone had gone in or out recently. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside. The air smelled different. Less dusty, more like hay that had been disturbed. My eyes adjusted, and I noticed fresh hoof marks near the center of the barn. They were small but sharp, pressed deep into the dirt, the kind of marks an anxious young horse would make when shifting side to side. The stall where I found the water bucket earlier was open now. The rope that had once hung loosely on the side had been moved. It was coiled carefully, too neatly to be accidental. Someone had been here, and not long before I arrived. I walked slowly toward the stall, letting my footsteps stay quiet. Inside, the bedding looked disturbed. Not messy, just recently used. A small section of the wood had a fresh scratch, thin and short, like it had been made by a hoof instead of a nail. I leaned down and placed my hand on the bedding. It still held warmth. Not much, but enough to tell me that the horse had been there within the hour. A sudden sound behind me made me straighten immediately, light steps on the wooden floor. Not mine. I turned sharply, expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, but the opening was empty. Still, I felt movement in the shadows near the back corner of the barn. I took one step forward, but before I got far, a voice whispered from outside the wall. "You came back?" The words were soft, barely above a breath, familiar, cautious. I stepped outside the barn and saw Mara standing there again. She kept her distance, as if unsure how close she wanted to be. Her eyes studied my face with a mix of relief and worry. She looked different from last time, more tired, as though she had not slept well. I asked her if she knew who was caring for the little horse. Her expression tightened instantly. Instead of answering, she glanced at the forest, then back at the barn. Her hands trembled slightly, even though she tried to hide it. She said the truth was tangled, and unraveling it would not be easy. I told her I had already seen enough to know something serious had happened here, and she was one of the few who could help me understand it. Mara exhaled slowly, like she had been holding her breath for too long. She said someone had been using the old barn recently, but they did not trust anyone enough to admit it. She said the tiny horse had not been abandoned by choice. He had been brought here on the worst night the town had seen in years. Her voice broke slightly as she spoke, but she regained her composure. She said the horse was special, not in size or strength, but in the kind of quiet courage that only shows itself in the hardest moments. I asked her who brought him. She looked toward the old house on the hill, her eyes growing distant. She said the person who brought the horse here had been running from something. Something heavy, something they could not carry anymore. She opened her mouth to say more, but stopped abruptly. Her gaze flicked behind me, sharp and alarmed. I turned quickly, expecting to find someone approaching, but, again, there was no one in sight. The empty space felt wrong, though, as if someone had been standing there just a moment earlier and slipped away the second we looked. The feeling of being watched intensified, heavy and unsettling. Mara told me that whoever had been caring for the horse was still close by, too close. She said she had seen a figure moving near the forest each night, keeping watch over the barn. She had tried calling out to them once, but they never answered. They only stepped deeper into the shadows and disappeared again. Her voice grew quieter. She said she feared that the person was hiding not just from the town, but from their own mistakes. And the tiny horse was the only living link left to what had happened years ago. I asked her again what that past was, but she shook her head. She wasn't ready to speak it aloud. Not yet. Before she left, she told me one more thing. She said the little horse did not belong to the person who brought him here. The horse had belonged to someone else. Someone who had not been seen in a long time. Someone whose name still made people pause when they heard it. Her words left the air tense and heavy. The conflict that had once seemed far away now felt close enough to touch, yet still out of reach, as if the truth stood just behind a thin veil I had not yet lifted. After Mara left, I stayed near the barn for a while longer, trying to piece everything together. The small hoof prints, the nightly figure near the forest, the careful way the horse was cared for, the fabric scrap, the silence of the older woman, the sorrow in the old man's eyes. All of it connected, though in a way I still could not fully trace. I walked toward the forest, stopping where the footprints had vanished last time. I listened, waiting for any sound. For a while there was only the wind. Then faintly I heard something soft, a whinny, high and delicate. The kind of sound a young or small horse makes when unsure of their surroundings. It came from deeper in the trees. My pulse quickened. I followed the sound cautiously, stepping over roots and moving around low branches. The further I went, the darker the forest grew. The sunlight barely touched the ground and the air felt cooler. After a short distance, I found a narrow clearing I had not seen before. The grass there was flattened, and near the center was a rope lead lying in a circle, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. A small patch of soft dirt held fresh hoof marks, all small like the ones in the barn. The tiny horse had been here recently. I crouched to examine the marks, tracing them lightly. They led toward the thickest part of the forest, where the trees stood almost shoulder to shoulder. As I stood up, a shadow moved behind one of the trunks. It was quick, but not quick enough to hide from my eyes. A person stood there, tall but thin, shoulders hunched as if carrying something heavy. They turned slightly, just enough for me to see a faint glint of light catch their eyes. Then they stepped back into the darkness and vanished before I could call out. My heart raced, but I followed the path the tiny horse had taken, stepping deeper toward the thick grove. The air grew colder, the tension felt sharper. Every rustle made me turn my head. Every shift of shadow made me pause. I reached the edge of the dense trees when I heard a second sound. Not a horse this time. A voice, soft, strained. Someone whispering in a tone filled with guilt and desperation. I could not make out the words, but I knew instantly it belonged to the person who had been hiding. The tension in the story tightened like a rope pulled in two directions. I stepped forward, ready to confront whatever lay ahead, but before I crossed into the grove, the voice stopped. Silence dropped heavy. Then the tiny horse cried out again, sharper this time, full of fear. I froze. The climax was coming. I could feel it in the air. Everything was leading to something big, something that could change everything I understood about the land, the people, and the small horse who carried more truth than anyone else. And for the first time, I realized I might already be caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than I expected. I pushed past the first line of trees, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed off the bark. The tiny horse cried again, the sound sharp and frightened, and it pulled me deeper into the forest without hesitation. Every step felt heavier, like each one carried the weight of all the unanswered questions that had been building since the day I first brought him home. The shadows thickened the further I went, and the air grew colder, but the path ahead became clearer with each cry that broke through the silence. The clearing finally opened in front of me, a small circle surrounded by tall pines. At the center of it stood the tiny horse, trembling, his head lowered but his ears pointed toward something moving behind the thick bush at the far side. His rope hung loose, dragging across the ground as if he had slipped free from someone's hands. I moved slowly toward him, speaking softly so he knew I was there. He turned his head when he heard my voice, his frightened breathing easing just enough to show he recognized me. But before I could reach him, a figure stepped out from behind the bush. The person who had been hiding all this time finally stood in full view. It was a man, thin and tired, his clothes worn enough to tell he had been wandering for days. His hands shook slightly as he tried to calm himself, and his eyes carried something I recognized at once: regret, the kind of regret that settles deep inside a person when they have been running from their own choices for far too long. He looked at the tiny horse the way someone looks at a memory they wish they could change. I asked him who he was, and he hesitated before answering. He said he had once lived in the town, years ago, but left after making a mistake that cost him everything. The tiny horse had belonged to someone he cared for deeply, someone who trusted him. When things fell apart, he took the horse and disappeared, too ashamed to face anyone again. But the guilt only grew heavier, and instead of freeing him, it trapped him even more. When I asked why he brought the horse back to the old property, he said it was the only place that still held part of the past he lost. He had hoped the land would help him find some kind of forgiveness. But fear kept him from stepping forward during the day. He fed the horse at night and kept to the shadows, not ready to face the people he had hurt or the truth he had run from. He looked at the rope in his hand, his fingers shaking. He said the horse had slipped away during the night and wandered off before he could stop him. When he followed, he heard me approaching and panicked, afraid the town would think he had come back with bad intentions. He had been hiding ever since, trapped between fear of being seen and fear of letting the horse run off again. The tiny horse moved toward him, nudging his arm gently as if reminding him he was not as alone as he believed. The man dropped to one knee, overwhelmed by the small gesture. I stood quietly, letting him find the right words. He said he never meant to abandon the horse. He had loved him from the start, but believed he did not deserve to care for him anymore. That belief, more than anything else, had driven him into hiding. I told him the horse still trusted him, and that trust meant something real. I said the only way forward was to stop running and face the truth that had been following him through the forest all this time. He stared at me for a long moment, trying to gather the strength to do what he had avoided for years. Then he nodded slowly. We walked back toward the barn together, the tiny horse staying close between us like a bridge connecting both sides of the story. As we stepped out of the forest, I noticed Mara waiting near the fence. Her eyes widened when she saw the man beside me, and she let out a quiet breath that sounded like a mixture of relief and sorrow. She walked toward him with careful steps, unsure of how to begin. When she finally spoke, she told him she had waited for years to hear the truth from him. He bowed his head, unable to meet her eyes, and said he was ready to tell everything. We gathered inside the old house while the tiny horse wandered around the barnyard, finally relaxed after days of tension. Mara listened as the man told the full story, his voice steady but heavy. He explained how everything had gone wrong in his life, how he let fear guide him instead of honesty, and how he had not known how to come back once he realized how much damage he had done. Mara did not speak for a long time after he finished. When she finally did, her voice was gentler than before. She said forgiveness did not erase the past, but it opened a door to something better if he was willing to walk through it. The older woman from the nearby house joined us soon after, having noticed the lights inside the old place for the first time in months. When she saw the man, her hands flew to her mouth. She had known him too, years ago, before everything had changed. Her eyes softened as she listened to the truth revealed at last. She told him that kindness was not lost forever and that he still had a chance to make things right. The old man from the fence came later, his slow steps steady with purpose. He listened quietly, then placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. He told him that running solves nothing and that returning, even late, took more courage than leaving ever did. The man nodded, tears forming in his eyes for the first time. The town took time to accept him again. Trust is slow to rebuild, especially when broken once. But the tiny horse played a bigger part in healing than any of us expected. The young people in the town adored him. Families came to see him. His gentle nature softened the rough edges of old memories. And gradually the man began helping around the property again, proving day by day that he meant every word of his apology. As for me, I kept visiting often. The place no longer felt heavy with fear. It began to feel warmer, alive with the sound of laughter and quiet conversations. The tiny horse grew stronger, his coat shining, his steps confident. He had found a home, not because he was useful or valuable in the eyes of traders, but because he held a kind of goodness that brought out the same in others. Reflecting on everything, I realized the story had never been just about a tiny horse rejected at auction. It had been about second chances, about the courage to face mistakes, about rebuilding trust, and about how even the smallest creature can carry the greatest reminder that hope never disappears completely. It waits quietly until someone chooses to pick it up again. The land looked different now. Not because the buildings changed, but because the people around it did. The barn no longer felt abandoned, the forest no longer felt dangerous, and the tiny horse stood in the sunlight each morning with a peacefulness that stretched far beyond him. The man who once hid in the shadows now worked openly, greeting the townsfolk with steady eyes. Mara helped him restore the old house, board by board. The older couple brought fresh hay each week. The old man repaired the fence. And every day, the tiny horse stood at the gate waiting for whoever came next, his presence reminding us that even the most broken stories can find their way to a gentle ending. The world was not perfect, but it felt honest again. And as the sun set across the open fields, casting its warm glow over the land, the tiny horse lifted his head high, as if sensing that his journey had finally brought everyone to the place they needed to be, a place where forgiveness lived. A place where peace returned. A place where even a small horse could change everything without ever saying a word.